Welcome back to season 5 of the So Cultured podcast, where we are talking all about your favorite conspiracy theories and whether we could prove or disprove them with science. So, welcome to season 5, Debunked.
Yeah, so last week we covered the topic of whether or not the moon landing is fake. If you guys listened in on last week's episode, you will know that today we are covering the lab leak hypothesis. But just on the topic of conspiracy theories, my family love a conspiracy theory. Like my sister, my uncle, everybody loves them, and we get really into our conspiracy theories. Like they're taken very, very seriously. And every single Christmas, there is some big debate about a conspiracy theory. And I can tell you guys this because my uncle is never going to listen to this podcast. I hope not. But he is the biggest conspiracy theorist I've ever met, like tinfoil and all. And this year, we was literally sat having Christmas dinner, and I feel like conspiracy theories, they always bring up conspiracy theories at just the most random times. Like we literally just sat down to eat our Christmas dinner, and then he starts wanting to have a debate about whether evolution is a lie or not. And listen, I don't think the topic of evolution is on the cards for this season, but it's definitely one that I need to read into because I had enough knowledge to be like, you're an idiot, but also didn't have enough knowledge, like as much knowledge as I wanted to. Do you know what I mean? Because conspiracy theories are hard to argue with. You've got to have the hard, solid facts. I mean, I guess that is the whole point of this season, right? Is like we're giving you guys the hard, solid facts. So next time someone at Christmas dinner wants to argue with you about whether the moon landing is fake, you've got it all. Like you guys are so prepared.
Yeah, that's exactly it. We are literally preparing you for those talks with the random uncle or aunt who believes these crazy theories. Like, I can tell you, for one, being a virologist, how many times people have come up to me and said these crazy, wild theories about COVID-19 and the pandemic. So I completely empathize with you and your uncle because I actually do it all the time.
Although I do love a wild conspiracy theory. You know the ones that are so unbelievable, but you just like somehow convince yourself they're right. And like I got so into Pizzagate and fully convinced myself that like it was all real. And I've even been to see some conspiracy theories give live talks, like David Icke. Again, the true conspiracy theorists will know who David Icke is. And if you don't, read up on him because he is batshit. But you've got to give him the credit because he's so good at putting together stories and evidence that he actually convinces you. Like he could convince me that this top is red. Do you know what I mean?
They're really convincing.
Yeah, like sometimes, do you know what? Like it's so fun to entertain conspiracy theories. As this series will show us, some of these conspiracy theories, they're not so much theory. Do you know what I'm saying? So
yeah.
Anyway, talking of all of this, let's get into the lab leak hypothesis because I am very, very excited for this. And actually, when we asked our listeners to send in like what theories they want us to debunk, vaccines, COVID-19, viruses was like top of the list. So I know the listeners are going to be really excited for this. So let's not waste any more time. Let's get into it.
This is Debunked by the So Cultured podcast,
hosted by Liv and Haz, two girls exploring the world of science and tech, unfiltered.
This season, we're separating fact from fiction as we dive into the world's most controversial conspiracy theories by seeing if science can prove or disprove them.
And of course, we're still serving up the laboraTEAAAA
because the STEM world is messier than you think.
Don't forget, all opinions are our own, and all of our listener stories are alleged. Let's get into this week's episode of Debunked.
Responsible for an ongoing pandemic and 3 crazy years of a global health emergency, the SARS-CoV-2 virus has infected over 700 million people and claimed the lives of over 7 million people. But one mystery still remains. Where did it come from? Just over 5 years ago, in the heart of a bustling city, this virus first emerged. Was it nature's doing, an unfortunate but inevitable jump from animal to human, or was it leaked from a high security laboratory and covered up. Are scientists truly in debate about the origins? Has it been driven by a political agenda, and will it always be a mystery? So let's debunk. And before I get into today's episode, I just want to give a quick disclaimer as a virologist. First and foremost, that this episode is all about informed discussion and will be based on peer-reviewed evidence only. Okay?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. That's what this season is all about. Like, we are here to debunk or not debunk your favorite conspiracy theories. So I guess let's start there, Taz. What actually is the lab leak theory? Because I think I know what it is, but I'm not too sure. So let's start there.
Yeah, so let's rewind to late 2019, and reports begin to emerge from Wuhan, China, about a mysterious pneumonia-like illness. And the initial theory was that it was a zoonotic spillover event, which just means that the virus jumped from an animal, likely a bat, to humans, possibly through an intermediate host at the now infamous Hunan seafood market. But almost immediately, some scientists and journalists started to consider an alternative theory for the origin of the outbreak. Why? Because Wuhan is not only home to the Hunan seafood market, but also Wuhan Institute of Virology, or WIV for short, one of China's top-level research facilities, which also happens to study bat coronaviruses. And the mere coincidence of a coronavirus outbreak occurring in the same city as this lab was enough to spark speculation. Now, those who believe the lab leak theories are usually in one of two camps, right? They either believe the lab leak was accidental and then covered up, or think more extremely and believe the virus was purposely released as a bioweapon.
That is so interesting. I did not know about that institute. I'm actually surprised I didn't know about that. Like, considering how much of a thing the lab leak hypothesis is. I mean, like I said, I don't know too much about it, but I'm surprised. Don't most virology institutes or institutes that have like virology departments, don't most of them study coronavirus? Like, how niche is it? Is my question.
It is fairly niche. In like the Western world, we don't really, until now, obviously, we don't really study like bat coronaviruses. There are people that do study it. I think it's more prevalent in China because obviously they had the SARS outbreak. So obviously that's more of a driving force for like studying bat coronaviruses. So that might be more prevalent over there. But yeah, from like a UK point of view and a now Australia point of view, I didn't see it as like a common research area before.
Okay.
People focused on things that caused widespread disease like influenza, things like that. So yeah.
Okay, that is interesting. So it definitely is quite niche then. So like I guess it is a bit weird that they're studying it so close to this seafood market. Interesting. Are there any other basis for the lab leak theory, or is it literally just that link is why people think why this lab leak theory exists?
The main driving factor for all of this, right, and for any theories at all, is the fact that one, we don't have a patient zero, which isn't a widely used term anymore. They usually refer to the first patient as the index patient because just FYI, patient zero is a bit like, I don't know, you could probably refer to it as a bit of a slur now.
Yeah, like, oh, you're patient zero. Like, I wouldn't want to be called patient zero. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, that's...
Yeah. So we don't have, I'm just going to call it for the purposes of dramatics, we don't have or didn't have a patient zero. And two, SARS-CoV-2 was not detected in any animals at the time of the outbreak. Now, why is finding a patient zero important in disease outbreaks? Well, if you've ever seen the film Contagion, I don't know, then you'd know it's such a good film. And actually, you'd probably get like kind of PTSD watching it because it's very similar to what happened in the pandemic. And it came out like way before. But basically, when disease outbreaks like these occur, epidemiologists, so Kate Winslet in the film, will go to the heart of the outbreak to trace back where the virus came from. And that usually involves talking to affected persons about their activities and who they saw, as well as like surveillance activities to detect instances of virus transmission. And in the film, she does a great job of determining who patient zero is. And then by default, it was determined that the source of the outbreak was an infected pig carcass. And this film was reflective of what happens in true events. So take the 2014 Ebola outbreak as a really good example. So this outbreak resulted in around 28,000 cases and around 11,000 deaths, and it affected 10 countries in Africa, Europe, and North America. And the source of the outbreak was started with just one person, a 2-year-old boy from Guinea, and he was likely infected playing in a hollow tree which housed a colony of bats.
Oh my God, this poor little boy. Like,
I know.
imagine.
It's kind of a sad story, actually. I mean, the whole Ebola story
Yeah.
is really sad. But
Yeah.
the very bats from this colony was later determined to be serologically positive against the Ebola virus. So that indicates that they have had a previous infection because they have circulating antibodies, right? So that's a really good example of how epidemiologists trace back virus origins. So this sheer lack of information makes people question where it actually came from. And SARS-CoV-2 was detected in people who attended the market and the market itself, but we still don't know the source, and no reservoir species has been identified, like the bats in those hollow trees. That is kind of been determined as the reservoir for this Ebola virus, right? So the same can't be said for SARS-CoV-2.
Yeah, this is really interesting. And I know like a lot of scientists really laugh at conspiracy theorists, but really, I think it's human nature to want to know the answers to these questions. And actually, conspiracy theorists come up with very good questions. They ask very good questions, and they also search for answers, which is exactly what we do in science, right? So yeah, I think it's supernatural that people start to make up their own theories to explain these kind of events. So what else backs up this theory, or like what other evidence backs up the lab leak hypothesis?
Yeah, so there are a good few things that would back up this hypothesis. The first question I asked myself is, has this ever happened before? Have we ever seen a lab leak, and what were the effects of the lab leaks? And actually the answer is yes, but they are quite few and far between. So good example is in 1979, a Soviet research facility actually leaked anthrax and at least 68 people died. And slightly more recently, in 2007, there was a foot and mouth outbreak in the UK, which was caused by a leaky pipe at a high security laboratory. And this one is crazy, right? Because I know the exact lab, because people in my old lab in the UK still talk about it now. Like, they badmouth the other lab for ways that they did stuff. And basically how this lab leak occurred was people like dumping live virus down a sink, and they thought that what came out of the drainage was autoclaved and disinfected, right? And neutralized. But it turns out it wasn't, and there was actually like a leak in the pipe. So there was live virus just like going into the soil, and then it infected the farmland surrounding this lab, which is so crazy.
Oh my God. And when you deep it, yeah, like virology labs. So like, you know, if you're doing your PhD in virology, you could come straight from undergrad. There's literally an undergrad like dealing with like really deadly virus.
I remember being in like entertainment facilities, and I was just like, I'm just a girl. Do you know what I mean?
Literally just a girl.
But that actually like kind of leads me on to the next lab leak that I want to talk about. And this is the most notable one, right? Because there's been a number of small SARS outbreaks as a result of lab leaks in Taiwan, Singapore, and China. And in China, it all started with a breach, actually 2 separate breaches within a few weeks of each other at one of Beijing's top virology labs. And the reason why they knew it was 2 separate breaches is because a 26-year-old female postgraduate student, so like a PhD student, bless her, was admitted to hospital on April the 4th, 2004. And then Just 2 weeks later, while she was in hospital, a 31-year-old male postdoc became infected and was admitted to hospital in April 17th. So there were 2 instances, and there were actually delays in identifying the first case, which allowed further infections to happen before like a wider public announcement was made. And the first patient was actually allowed to travel despite her illness and very high risk occupation. And unfortunately, her mother also fell ill and later died. So instances like these really cause the public to lose trust in those responsible for handling viruses like these in containment facilities. So that's like another basis for like why the lab leak hypothesis might be true.
Yeah, and I think that's the basis for really a lot of conspiracy theories is like lack of trust, right? So I think that's interesting what you say about delays in identifying the cause and then like I guess the wider public announcement, because I mean that definitely makes me question whether the response from like the Chinese government was good enough, like quick enough. So what actually was like China's initial response to SARS-CoV-2? Because we know obviously like we live in the UK, we know what the UK response was, and the listeners will know like their individual country, but what was China's initial response?
Back in 2021, the WHO actually worked with a team of Chinese scientists and released a report that concluded that a lab leak was extremely unlikely and that most probable explanation was spillover from animals either through an intermediate host or through direct contact with bats. And a small group of researchers said that they would not trust the report's conclusions because it was overseen by the Chinese government. And some observers felt that the WHO's statement was really premature. But then other scientists found the report convincing and agreed that there was no evidence of a laboratory origin for the virus. But in fact, the WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom stated that the team had in fact experienced difficulty accessing raw data and that while the lab leak was the least likely theory, further investigations were required to obtain more data to actually rule it out. And in relation to the original report, the leader of the WHO investigatory team, Peter Ben Embarek, said, say an employee of the lab gets infected while working in a bat cave collecting samples, such a scenario would technically be a lab leak, but it would also fit our first hypothesis of direct transmission of the virus from bat to humans. So in saying this, they weren't necessarily technically ruling out the lab leak, they were just backing up their statement that it was still direct transmission from an animal, right? The WHO then proposed a second phase of research calling for audits of relevant laboratories in Wuhan, and that didn't go over well with China, which dismissed the request as disrespectful and accused critics of politicizing the study. Meanwhile, other countries, including like countries in the EU and the US, pushed for more transparency and access to original samples. This didn't really happen, and by early 2023, the WHO officially dropped its original investigation.
I don't really get though, like how could you prove that it was a lab leak versus direct animal to human transmission? This is the same with the moon landing one. It's like you couldn't really prove that it happened, but you also couldn't really prove that it didn't happen. So it's like you're just weighing up the evidence here, I guess.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's definitely odd about the raw data, right? Like that's a bit odd.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier about the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So then what were they actually doing in there? And was it cause for concern? Like when they did their investigation, did they look, like surely they looked specifically at this institute, right?
This was really the driving factor for this theory because at this institute, there was a research group looking specifically into bat coronaviruses and SARS. So not SARS-CoV-2, SARS-CoV-1 essentially. They would do huge surveillance programs where they would take samples primarily from horseshoe bat colonies to determine the bat coronavirus's present, and more specifically SARS-like coronaviruses, so coronaviruses that are more closely related to SARS. And they did indeed find these prior to the pandemic. They also did a lot of work on SARS and how it differed to the circulating bat coronaviruses in the way that it would infect human cells through the ACE2 receptor, which is the same receptor that SARS-CoV-2 uses. And one scientist at the forefront of this research was Shi Zhengli. In 2008, she published 2 papers which studied the binding of spike proteins of both natural and chimeric SARS-like coronaviruses to ACE2 receptors in human cells to determine the mechanism by which SARS may have spilled over into humans, right? In this research and in doing this, they actually determined that ACE2 receptors were really highly variable in the different bat populations. And they also did work on pseudotype viruses, which are basically viruses that can't replicate. And I've mentioned them in the podcast before because I've actually made my own pseudotype viruses and basically did the exact same thing as these researchers, but with like different viruses. So I did lyssaviruses. Anyway, they had a look specifically at the spike protein of both SARS and SARS-like bat coronaviruses. And they first wanted to find out if any of the bat coronaviruses could infect human cells through the human ACE2 receptor. And it turned out that they couldn't. And the SARS pseudotype could not infect cells expressing the bat ACE2. Right, so they're highly specific to the cells that they infect through the specific ACE2 receptors. So they then had a go at making a chimeric spike protein, which is basically where they took some of the sequence from the SARS spike protein and then inserted it into the bat SARS-like spike protein. And after making the pseudotype viruses that expressed this new spike protein, the pseudotype virus could now infect cells expressing the human ACE2 receptor. So they basically made a completely new spike, mixing the bat coronavirus and the SARS coronavirus spike proteins, and it could now have the ability to infect human cells. Now, when I was doing the research for this, I was actually kind of concerned, but my mind was obviously put at ease by the fact that we're using pseudotype viruses because that doesn't result in an infection, okay? But when I came across another paper by Shi, published in 2017, it described the surveillance of SARS-like viruses in bat populations and how recombination events, which is basically where 2 viruses infect one host and recombine to form a new virus strain, were basically extremely common in these bat populations due to the number of different isolates found.
Right.
And as a result, it was hypothesized that SARS-CoV-1 arose from recombination events like these. So basically, they did a lot of surveillance of these bat populations, found some virus isolates. They were either live virus or they had like nucleic acid detection. So like they detected the RNA. And in the cases where they only detected the RNA, they engineered their own virus to be like reflective of what was in the RNA code. And then they wanted to see that if any of the bat coronaviruses that they found could enter human cells. And they found that 3 of them could. These kind of activities set alarm bells off in my head because they are creating like novel viruses in the lab based on sequences that they found.
But why? My point is like, why were they doing this? So like, let me just make sure I'm following. So they essentially created a new virus to see if it could enter human cells through the ACE2 receptor. Is that right? Or am I just like being an idiot?
So no, that's correct.
But why?
The whole point is kind of like outbreak preparedness, right?
Yeah, and then they caused the outbreak. Sorry, I'm on this theory already. Is it because, like, for example, they hypothesized that this is how SARS-CoV-1 came about, so then they were like, trying to test that theory?
So not only are they trying to like test the theory of how SARS came about, like they're trying to get to the root cause of why SARS came about, where it came from, and basically determine that there's such a large amount of bat coronaviruses circulating in bat populations that in some cases 2 viruses or 3 viruses infect one bat at one time, and they recombine in the host cells and basically spit out a completely new virus. And basically they wanted to test this theory, and they also wanted to test whether some of the bat coronaviruses that they'd found could infect human cells. So it's a combination. Like some bat coronaviruses couldn't, but then they recombined with another virus and then suddenly could. And they reflected this process in the lab with the first paper that I spoke about. Then the second paper that I spoke about, they did a load of surveillance and then wanted to test whether any of them could infect human cells. And they could. But in doing that, sometimes they only had like the RNA detection of the virus, not the live virus, because it's kind of hard to isolate live virus from samples. So sometimes they re-engineered the virus from the RNA to kind of see how it would act in nature. So that's essentially what they did. But obviously it kind of like brings alarm bells in your head, because you're like, they're creating viruses in the lab. And from like a conspiracy theorist point of view, they're creating new viruses in the lab, you know?
Yeah.
So I was so deep in this research, and I was actually getting so wrapped up and carried away in everything that I've mentioned so far regarding like the lab activities. I also at one point found evidence of a supposed, and if you're listening, I'm put in inverted commas, a rejected grant proposal, which was posted anonymously online. And now this could be completely fabricated, so let's just put that out there. But
give it to me.
The grant proposal involved the same scientist, Shi Zhengli, and collaborators from the US and Singapore, and was submitted in early 2018, which is a bit suspicious given the sort of timeline of things. And the grantees proposed to sample bat coronaviruses from various locations in China and then evaluate the ability of bat viruses to infect human cells in the laboratory using chimeric coronaviruses, which were mutated in different locations, and then to create a protein-based vaccine out of the spike protein, not the whole virus, which would then be distributed to bats in the wild to reduce the chances of future human outbreaks. And one proposed alteration was to modify bat coronaviruses to insert a cleavage site for the furin protease of the spike protein, which is a characteristic found in SARS-CoV-2 and not many other coronaviruses. So it was a bit weird that that's the mutation that they proposed to put in. Now, obviously, the whole rejected grant proposal could be like a completely fabricated, as like the source is not known. It was posted anonymously online. However, the activities of this grant is not far off from what they were doing already in the lab. So from like a scientist's perspective myself, this is not, in my mind, too far-fetched a proposal, because it's like leading on from like stuff that they've already been doing.
Yeah, and also, like, for example, when I review papers, I have a folder on my computer where I store all of these papers, like in their original format before revision, right? So then if it gets rejected, that paper's still on my computer. Yeah. So it's like the reviewer of this grant proposal could have saved it like on their computer, just as you do when you're like reviewing something. Then all of this happened, and then they thought in their head, oh my God, like they thought back to that grant proposal, and then they're like, oh my God, I want the world to know. And then they put it out because they're like, the world needs to know this. Yeah. But I do think this is very interesting because it goes back to what you said about the theories for like the lab leak hypothesis, right? Is like, was it intentional or was it accident? And it sounds like to me, say they were doing this project, it could have definitely resulted in an accidental lab leak. 100%. Like, I'm convinced. I'm so convinced. I need you to just like get me off this train, because now I'm just like so convinced, and I've been so against the lab leak hypothesis, but now can't lie, it's all looking a bit sus.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, like during the pandemic, I was very open to the idea of it being a lab leak. I mean, some people were very, very opposed. I was like, I don't think we can rule it out, to be honest. Like, accidents do happen. And, like, I'm sorry, but
Yeah.
you're not going to be the scientist that stands up and says, you
It
know
was
what,
me.
guys, it was me. Like, I was the
Yeah.
cause of it. And as we know
100%.
from the previous episode of this series, is that governments could cover up stuff.
The government, like you say, the government doesn't even need to be involved. Like, they don't know either, right? Because if it was like one scientist who made a mistake, how do you ever know? Because like we said, you can't really prove for certain that it was a lab leak. So like the government might not even be involved.
Yeah. I mean, I've like brought you up to this point to really convince you that the lab leak could be legit. But let me start unraveling this theories just like you did in episode 1. Like, you kind of
Okay.
convinced me that the moon landing could be fake, and then you kind of
Yeah, this is
unraveled it
karma.
all for me. So let's get into
Okay.
it.
Okay.
You know, Liv, I've been deep in research for this episode, and I swear some of these academic papers are like trying to decipher ancient manuscripts. Like, why do they use tiny fonts, the most hard technical jargon to understand? And like, some of the sentences are so long, they're literal paragraphs. Like, I swear they purposely make it hard to understand.
That's literally so true. I feel like every time I open a paper, I literally like immediately regret my life choices. I'm not even joking.
But this is honestly why I started using Audemic, because it turns these like complex papers into audio, so I can listen to them instead of getting lost in like a sea of text, which has been so useful for researching on this podcast, because I can just listen to things and not have to physically read the paper.
Yeah, exactly. And that is why they are the sponsor of today's episode. So whether you're commuting, cooking, working out, or even just lying in bed pretending to be productive, Audemic lets you absorb information without the usual struggle. You can adjust playback speed, follow along with text highlighting, and even take notes all in one place.
Yeah, and you can also choose from different natural sounding voices, accents, and even genders to make it more engaging. Plus, over 40,000 people already use the app, including students from top universities like Berkeley and Oxford. So it's very clear that it's a game changer, and you can take it from us as well. We have been loving it.
Yep, and if you want to try it out for yourself, Audemic offers a 7-day free trial, so you can try it completely free before committing. And we also have a discount code that will pop on screen now so that you can get money off. So if you're interested in giving Audemic a go, then we will pop the link to them in today's episode or video description. But for now, let's get back to today's episode.
So I want to start off by saying there's been a lot of analysis on the earliest SARS-CoV-2 isolates and their sequence. And typically, when you clone viruses, you do see remnants of the cloning techniques in the sequence of the virus. So one example is by looking at restriction sites of the sequence. So basically, restriction sites is where the DNA is cut, and then you can replace things in between those restriction sites. So a virus from cloning techniques would typically have more restriction sites than a virus that is just like found in nature and directly isolated from an animal. And that's just one example that I know firsthand about, but there are numerous studies that look at other aspects of the sequence and compare them to circulating SARS-like viruses to determine if certain features are naturally occurring or just like completely novel. Shi Zhengli's paper uses restriction digestion, which, as I said, would leave a trace in the sequence of the engineered virus. Also, Shi Zhengli's work specifically focuses on raising awareness for potential outbreaks, and in all of the papers that I read, it always stated that the high recombination events and the diversity of bat coronaviruses circulating in bat populations in China were really cause for concern and a public health threat. And the location of the institute isn't suspicious either, as these surveillance virology labs are often built near potential outbreak areas.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I hadn't even really thought about that. And I guess it's reassuring in a way. Okay, obviously she had these viruses to work with, but were any of those related to SARS-CoV-2 or not?
Yeah, that is a really important point, right? Because in all of her previous works, she generated viruses from sequences she identified in bat populations, okay? So they were all like evidence of circulating bat coronaviruses at the time. And all of the work that has ever been published in this way has just been on SARS, okay? And SARS-like viruses closely related to SARS-CoV, or like SARS-CoV-1, not SARS-CoV-2. And when SARS-CoV-2 first emerged, closest related virus to SARS-CoV-2 ever detected was a virus called rat-G13, with a sequence similarity of 96%. And that sounds like a lot, right? 96%. But a 4% difference is equal to about 11,050 mutations. And that is equal to decades of evolutionary diversion. So to put it into perspective, SARS-CoV-2 mutates at a rate of 24 mutations per year. So if we do like 11,000 divided by 24, we get like 40 years or something. So it's a very different virus. And in addition to this, rat-G13 was only ever detected through genome sequencing, and there was no live virus ever detected. And since then, more closely related coronaviruses have been detected in other countries such as Laos, and collectively the data demonstrates, lab manipulation or not, it was not the progenitor virus of SARS-CoV-2, just the closest known relative at the beginning of the pandemic. Also, I just want to point out as well that this type of like mutational analysis on known viruses and like virus surveillance in this way is pretty common in determining like the risk to human health. So it's not like she and her research group would be like the only people doing this. Like even I've done it. Like we do bat surveillance programs in the UK to look at lists of viruses. Obviously now that's extended to coronaviruses as well.
Sorry, it's just making me laugh because I'm just remembering when in like series 1 when we were talking about like sending you bats in Tupperware for you to work on.
Yeah, I know. So guys, it's widely done. Like even I've done it, but yeah, ultimately there was zero evidence to portray that SARS-CoV-2 or related viruses were detected prior to the pandemic by this research institution. And like being real, any detection of a new virus in a bat would have been reported because it's like a really easy paper to get out. Like we've detected this new virus, like it would have been published, you know.
Yeah.
I'm going to lead on to another reason why it's probably not come from a lab, because we wouldn't have seen the genetic diversity that we did see during the pandemic. Because if SARS-CoV-2 had been generated in the lab and cultured in human cells, it would have been way more adapted to multiplying and replicating in human cells. And in the pandemic, when SARS-CoV-2 first showed up, it's been shown to be constantly evolving and picking up mutations to make it more infectious and better at spreading. And one of the earliest and quickest adaptations was the D614 mutation in the spike protein, which made the virus more transmissible. Now, if this was cultured in a lab, then it's hypothesized that it would have picked up this mutation in the lab before going out into general population. And then we also saw a series of other key mutations to like what we know now as Omicron, proving that SARS-CoV-2 didn't start out perfectly adapted to humans and it evolved to get there.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I hadn't really thought about that actually. So anyway, like as you were talking, I was wondering, going back to the market, why was the market even ever thought to be the origin? Like how do they trace it back to the origin?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. And this point is key in determining that it likely did originate from or around the Hunan seafood market. So the earliest cases of SARS-CoV-2 were mostly associated with food markets. And on the 13th of December in 2019, 2 of the 3 first cases reported by the WHO were traced back to the west wing of the Hunan seafood market. And over the next 2 weeks, there was an increased abundance of cases associated with specific locations within the market, rippling outwards from specifically the western side of the market. And when you look at the cases in Wuhan itself, so like zooming out of the seafood market, the cases cases in early December are localized around the market, with 0 cases near the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So the location of the infected persons really pinpointed the source of the infection to be in or near this seafood market, and really not the institute at all. And epidemiology is really key in determining where infections start and are usually always very accurate. For example, in 1967, there was actually an outbreak of Marburg virus, and this was a completely novel virus. We'd never seen it before, but it happened to originate from an infected monkey which had been used for cells. So these cells were already infected with Marburg virus, and in this case, it was an accidental lab leak, and all of the cases could be traced back to the lab. So the epidemiology is a really good indicator of working out where virus outbreaks occur.
You said earlier about not knowing where the virus came from, like animal wise. So what is the speculation for that, and why? Like, do we know what animal it came from?
Yeah, so that's really important to know, and it also adds another curveball to this episode. And I'm going back to the initial WHO report, which was deemed as premature and investigated that lab leak theory. But in that same report, it also stated that there was no evidence for the selling of live animals at the market, as people who lived there had reported as such. However, there was an eminent researcher and virologist, Edward Holmes, and he had previously been to that market in 2014 and was in fact taken there by the Chinese CDC as an example of a place where coronavirus spillover could occur. And he happened to take some pictures whilst he was there. He happened to snap photos of live animals being sold at the market, most notably live raccoon dogs, which are known to be intermediate hosts. And even more notably, these were located in the southwestern part of the market, where we saw the first cases originate. And in fact, after the WHO published their report, other researchers who had done considerable work into live animal markets and associated diseases disputed this, as well as they had evidence of a number of live animals being sold at this market, including raccoon dogs as well.
That's sus. So another question then is, like, when the WHO went, did they like take any samples, or did they find any infected meat or animals?
They did environmental testing after the market's closure, and it detected SARS-CoV-2 in samples primarily from the western section. And there was also retrospective testing of animal carcasses, which didn't yield any positive results for SARS-CoV-2, but the tested samples did not include raccoon dogs, which was what we're kind of hypothesizing to be the intermediate host and like the susceptible species. And not only that, but there were 2 circulating lineages of SARS-CoV-2. So that's what they found. They found 2 different lineages of SARS-CoV-2. And that means that there were probably 2 different sources and more than one spillover event. So one which was associated with the Hunan food market and one that wasn't. So for example, in that case, 2 different animals infected with SARS-CoV-2 viruses, which moved independently through Wuhan markets through a shared supply chain. That is where they think the 2 lineages came from. And a similar thing was actually seen in the outbreak of SARS-CoV, which is where there was a large genetic diversity in animals sold at different markets.
Oh, I don't know, you thrown me a bit of a curveball there, because I was kind of just going to be like, no, I don't think it was a lab leak. Like, I was fully on that fence, but then like, so essentially like 2 random outbreaks at the same time.
Yes.
And I know you just said it's happened before, but I don't know.
What you've got to think about opportunistic transmission events is that usually you can have like convergent evolution, right? So if we go back to Zheng Li's initial studies, right? She did surveillance of bat coronaviruses, and she found, out of her surveillance of these bat coronaviruses, she found 3 that were capable of infecting humans. So basically you could say the same things happened here, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's been circulating viruses, and then been this opportunity to infect a number of raccoon dogs, and it just so
Yeah.
happens that 2 viruses were capable of
Did.
doing that.
Yeah.
And then these raccoon dogs were hunted and taken to Wuhan through the same supply chain. And then that's where they were exposed to humans. And that kind of would argue against the lab leak theory, right? Because, like I said before, there would be less genetic diversity and there would probably only be one virus. So, yeah.
So the only thing that stuck in my mind throughout this episode that makes me think like, it's the grant proposal for me. But then the more I think about it, the more I'm like, is this suspicious science or is this just a good scientist? Like, a good scientist is hot on what could potentially happen. They're researching it already. So like, really, the grant proposal, when you really deeply think about it, is not that weird. I genuinely just think it was a good scientist doing good research.
And a curveball to all this is that if that grant proposal did go ahead and they did do that research and they did vaccinate these bats, would
my
SARS-CoV-2 happen?
No, that's a really good point. But my final conclusion is not a lab leak. What do you think as a virologist?
When I was doing the research into this and like was reading the papers, I was concerned, but I have to be reflective of the fact in my lab. I've done the exact same thing. And yeah, the whole goal is to like prevent threats to public health through these zoonotic events. So that's like you said, that's the whole purpose of the research.
It's good science. Yeah. Literally
And ultimately,
science.
I think the bottom line is we don't know how much politics can play a role in the perpetuation of this lab leak theory. And I'm going to be a bit of a conspiracy theorist myself, right? I certainly find it interesting that under the Trump administration during the pandemic, Donald Trump used a lot of anti-China rhetoric like Kung flu, and also said in April 2020 that the Wuhan Institute was responsible for the pandemic, which there was like baseless evidence for it at that point. And how that translates to now, where Donald Trump is back in power. And just 3 days after John Ratcliffe was appointed the director of the CIA by Donald Trump, the CIA changed its stance on the lab leak theory from unlikely to likely, albeit with low confidence. But these kind of actions support Donald Trump's political agenda, right? So we really have to think about it from that perspective as well. And we always have to think about the political drivers of the conversation with events like these. But anyway, I'll leave you with this, that whilst there's still a gap between SARS-like viruses found in animals and SARS-CoV-2, that is not unusual, and tracing a virus back to its exact animal source can take years or literally not happen at all. For example, we still don't know the origins of viruses like hepatitis C, poliovirus, or even like the common cold coronaviruses. And it even took over a decade to just discover bat viruses with a more than 95% similarity to SARS-CoV-1 and able to use the human ACE2 as a receptor. So yeah, it might not ever happen.
Wow, this was so interesting. And for our listeners, of course, we want to know what you guys think after listening to this episode. Are you believing the lab leak? Or do we think the lab leak hypothesis is just a load of bullshit? So we, of course, just like we did last week, will put a poll on our Instagram story. And if you missed it last week, we're going to be putting a poll on our Instagram story every single week, asking you guys, what do you think of the conspiracy theory after you've listened to the episode? So if you want to take part in that, or even just see what other people think after listening to the episode, definitely come and follow us on Instagram, because we'll be sharing those each week. But yeah, thank you so much, Taz. This was so interesting, and I just feel like this was obviously gonna be your first episode, because it just makes so much sense, because like you said, like it's so amazing that you have done things literally similar to the research that we're talking about like in today's episode. Literally so cool. I mean, like, I have not done science as cool as this, so I love this for you. But for now, let's move on to our second listener story for season 5. It is time for our laboraTEAAA. Let's go.
but I'm worth it, 'cause I'll slip into your dreams tonight. Oh, so give me your heart. Baby, I'll take it tonight. I'll stick like glue inside your mind.
Okay, today's laboratory says, my lab mate is obsessed with me. So it says,
Oh.
hey girlies, first off, I can't express how much I love this podcast. It is such a gem. Thank you. I've recommended it to so many people. Now I need some advice. For context, I am a second year undergraduate biomedicine student. It says in brackets, I started uni a bit late, so I'm 25. I have a background as a lab technician in an R&D lab. And our program involves a lot of practical lab experiments. My lab partner is also a slightly older student with a similar background, so we naturally bonded. While we both get along with other people in the course, we're really each other's only close friend in the program. So here's the dilemma. She wants to do, in capitals, everything together. Seriously, everything. I'm someone who works better independently, and I've expressed that to her, but I'm finding it hard to set boundaries. Academically, I feel like I am stronger, and it's reached the point where I'm scared of being implicated in plagiarism. I really value our friendship and I don't want to lose it, but working together is affecting my performance. When we work on reports together, she often asks to read mine and then rewrites hers completely. Recently,
Oh.
she read an essay I was writing and submitted hers before me, using almost the exact same title and figures that I had spent a
Oh.
long time working out and generating. I'm also looking at doing a master's in data science, slay, love that. And all of a sudden, so is she, despite not being interested previously. It also doesn't help that we are literally next door neighbors and take the bus into uni together all the time. I'm really unsure how to handle this without upsetting her or damaging our friendship. Any advice would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. Oh my gosh. She's obsessed. Okay.
God. I feel a bit conflicted about this, I'm not gonna lie.
So do I. So do I. Because I can't lie. Like, as I said, I had a best friend on my biomedical course, and it was kind of like a similar vibe. I'm not going to lie, but she was also like literally my best friend, and she still is my best friend, and I love her to bits. So I also feel conflicted.
Yeah, and I was the exact same. I had like two very close friends who were on my course, and I don't know, like when we went through the course, we kind of helped each other on literally everything. And some of us were definitely stronger in some aspects than other people, but I feel like because they're your friend, you're just helping each other out.
I think that's the key, right? Is that you help each other out. Whereas if it's like, imagine if it was all one sided. So she's saying that she is the one who is doing all of the like figure generation. She's the one who's doing all of the writing, and the friend is just copying her. It's not like a two-way thing, because with me and my best friend is like, I would help with certain things, and then the next week she would be the one who would be helping me. And it was like back and forth. But it was, if it's literally you helping them all the time, I can't lie, that would get so frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be one person in the friendship that is academically stronger. It's not realistic that you're both going to be the same level of intelligence, like
Mhm.
statistically speaking, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like in those friendships, there is that dynamic of someone being more knowledgeable about the subject area.
Mhm.
So I feel like there's always going to be that dynamic, but it's just like where you draw the line. But then the way that uni is structured is completely different, because the grade boundaries aren't based on like what the whole cohort of people are getting. It's more like if you get a percentage, then that is going to be your grade kind of thing.
Mhm. Yeah.
And so I think like, who actually cares if you're helping out someone get a higher grade, because it's not impacting your grade? And I know she was talking about her essay, and I think that's a completely separate thing. But in relation to like helping someone out and getting them a better grade is not impacting, and it's not impacting your own grade, I actually think that's fine. When it comes to the essay writing, maybe you shouldn't have shared your essay before it was ready to submit. Like you could have submitted yours and then sent yours as like guidance. I don't know.
I mean, I think the problem is, I agree with you, but also I think sometimes it can negatively impact you because you spend time explaining a concept that you already understand to your friend. And if you're doing that all the time, then it does take away from you reading further on, and it does take away that difference between you getting like 80% of, yes, I understand all the stuff on this course, and you getting like 95% because you went and did extra reading. So I do think it matters, but I do get what you're saying in that, like, if you're going to study with people, like, yeah, and like, what is the harm in helping someone get a better grade? Although it's not your responsibility, there's no harm in you doing it. But I don't know, it's difficult because obviously now they're in this dynamic where they probably go to the library together, they work together. When they go in the lab, they work together, they've got an essay to work on together, they're literally next door neighbors, so they probably hang out and they're just doing it together. So it's like, if they're working that closely, then how do you get away with not helping them as much? I don't
Yeah.
know. It's a difficult one. Like, if it was me, I would, I don't know, what would I do?
I think you just have to try and set some boundaries in a nice way, right? So I feel like the essay thing was a step too far.
But then you could just lie and just say, when she's like, oh, have you done your essay? Oh, no, I haven't done it yet. I'll share it with you when I've done it. And then you just don't do it. Do you know what I mean? So if it was me, I would be like, oh, I'm really sorry, I haven't got around to doing it yet. I would come up with a reason as to why, like, all of a sudden I'm a little bit more busy than usual, and use that as an excuse to distance yourself a little bit, because it sounds like you just need like a little bit of space. And you don't want to stop hanging out with her, like you said. You don't want to lose the friendship, but maybe you just need a little bit of space. So what is a white lie? Do you know what I mean? Like, white lies are not bad sometimes. Just come up with a white lie as to why you're a little bit more busy. And then the next time she's like, hey, can we like study together? Just say, oh, you know, I'm really sorry, I'm busy learning Japanese actually on Duolingo, so I'm going to focus on that today. Do you know what I mean? Like, just come up with something completely random. Like, oh, sorry, I'm a bit busy with that today because this is a new hobby that I've taken up. And maybe we'll meet up tomorrow. And then you have some more solo study time where you don't have to be with her, but then also you don't have to have like the awkward conversations to why you don't want to be with her.
And I also think as well, like in your second year, your activities do naturally overlap a lot more. But when you go into your third year and you have like, you usually have like a research project, don't you?
Yes,
And
true.
you can take like different subjects and stuff. So you might find that your interests kind of like diverge. I definitely find like in third year, you are a lot more independent anyway because you're doing
Yeah,
your own
definitely.
research
100%.
project.
That's a really good point. And actually, what me and my best friend used to do was, she would, for example, take like one half of the project or one half of the essay. She would go and do like some reading on that, and then I would go and take the other half, and then we would like come back together and like share the stuff that we found, and then we'd use that to create our own essay, if you like. So you could totally do that with her. And we used to do it with revision. So like, she would learn one topic, teach it back to me, and I would do the same thing. So you're not doing it all. So you could definitely have like conversations prior to, for example, writing the essay, where you're like, okay, I'm going to do this, why don't you do that? And then you meet back up and then you share the knowledge that way, because that way you're still working with her, and you're not like, you know, spending time away from her, but in the same breath, like, you're both doing equal amounts of work. Do you know what I mean? I mean, obviously the issue is then like, she might do a shit job, and then
I was
then
going to
I
say,
don't know.
I'm like going to play devil's advocate and say that I am a control freak when it comes to stuff like that. So if it was like an essay, I'd be like, I will just do my own research.
Yeah, I mean, essays are a little bit more difficult, but if it's like, you know, when you had to do like lab reports and you'd have
Yeah.
like questions and stuff, like, that's kind of the thing that we'd work on together, or like revision. But at the end of the day, like, I think don't belittle it. Like, it definitely is totally valid what you're feeling, and it is really, really irritating to have someone steal all of your ideas and all of your hard work when you know that they've made no effort themselves. Like, that is annoying. And actually, I know it feels petty, but it's absolutely not. And if you are the type of person who feels, because I would feel awkward about it, but you, like, I don't think Taz would, because Taz, you're not the type of person who gets awkward about these things. Like, if I annoy Taz, she'll straight up be like, Liv, you're annoying me. Whereas I'll like dart around the the topic. So maybe you're more similar to Taz, in which case just be like, dude, what the hell? Like, if you're that good at friends, like, again, definitely had this conversation with my best friend where I was like, dude, what the hell? Like, I've literally done all the work. You've literally done nothing. Like, get your life together. You know what I mean? Like, sort it out. Get off of
Yeah.
Instagram and do some work. So I think it really depends on what the dynamic of your friendship is.
And I think as well, like you've got to remember that you helping her out like so much to the point that she's not really doing the work herself is actually a disservice to her.
Yeah,
And in the
100%. Good point.
future will manifest itself because there will come to a point where you're unable to help her and she'll have to do it herself and she'll be on a back foot because she's not been doing it for like the past 2 years. And I guarantee you will see the effects of that in third year when you do have to start doing stuff independently. And then wider, if you know you get a job, like you will be well equipped for that job where she might not be. So you just have to like factor that in as well. Like it
Mhm.
might be frustrating now, but like you will reap the rewards of like doing your independent work, and she
Yeah.
will see the negative effects of not doing her own stuff. So
Yeah.
there's that as well.
But anyway, I hope this advice was useful in one way or another. But yeah, thank you so much for writing in. And we are so happy to hear that you're enjoying our podcast. And of course, thank you so much for recommending us to all of your friends. We really
Yeah,
appreciate it.
thank
But that
you.
wraps up episode 2 of season 5 Debunked. And we will see you guys in episode 3. Bye, everyone.
Bye.